This is chapter 11 for AMP1. We're talking again about the nervous system. Here we're talking about the division of our nervous system. As a reminder, we have the central nervous system, which is your brain and spinal cord. The brain is the largest and the most complex part of your nervous system. It controls sensation, perception, movement, and thinking. The brain consists of two central or cerebral hemispheres, a structure deep inside called the diencephalon, the brainstem, then the cerebellum. The brainstem controls the brain to the spinal cord, and both brain and spinal cord control or connect to the peripheral nervous system by way of peripheral nerves. All of this is surrounded by a connective tissue type of membrane called meninges. It helps protect the brain and the spinal cord, and it lies between the bone and the soft tissue of the nervous system. Here again is a picture of our central nervous system. So the meninges is this membrane that will protect the brain and spinal cord, and there's 3 layers to it. They all have the second word called mater. Dura mater is the outer layer, and think durable. It's very dense, it's quite tough, and it helps with its protection. It is lined around the brain, as well as if you see this image is here on the right, we can see the dura mater. What happens is it kind of tips down into these openings, and so the dura mater is that outer layer. There is also the next layer is a middle layer called the arachnoid layer, and it's a web-like layer. It fills in this layer is where you're going to have your cerebrospinal fluid. It's in the subarachnoid space, meaning it's below this arachnoid mater. And then the last layer is the pia mater, which is an inner layer, and it's attached to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. And here you have blood vessels and nerves, and this is for nourishment to the central nervous system. So if our picture here, we have dura mater, arachnoid mater, and then our pia mater. And this blue in here is going to be where your cerebrospinal fluid is. Here's some images of the meninges around the brain and the spinal cord. It's really kind of like shrink wrap around it all. And it also dips into this space between the two hemispheres called the falx cerebri. There's a space also in by the cerebellum called the falx cerebelli, and deeper there's another kind of division called the tentorium cerebelli. You won't be tested on those details. This is just showing you some more detail of where the meninges are. It doesn't just wrap around the brain, it goes into the space of the brain tissue. So wherever there's a void of space in the brain, we have some meninges there for protection. This is another good picture of the meninges, and this is on the spinal cord. Here you can really see the layer as well. The dura, the arachnoid, and the pia mater. And then the blue under the arachnoid is where your cerebrospinal fluid is. Again, here's your meninges all the way down the spinal cord. Inside the cerebrum are some spaces called ventricles. Now, the meninges don't go into these. These are deep pockets, in a sense, in the cerebrum And there's 4 of them. Now, cerebral spinal fluid will be moving through these spaces. They are interconnected, and they are named, well, they're kind of numbered more than anything, but the first 2, we don't really differentiate the 2 because sometimes it's hard to know left and right, so we just call them lateral ventricles. They're the big ones that look like a horn or a sheep's horn. So this here is a lateral ventricle, here's another lateral ventricle. Those 2 lateral ventricles are often called the first and second ventricle, but for our purposes, we just refer to them as lateral ventricles because they're identical. The third ventricle is deeper, and that's in the middle. From this view, you can see it right in the middle here, and here's a better view. This is the third ventricle. It's kind of near the diencephalon, which we'll look at in a little while. And then the fourth ventricle is down by the spinal cord and the brain stem. They're all connected by little viaducts or aqueducts. Cerebral aqueduct is connecting our third and fourth ventricle. And this will go down into the spinal cord, into the interventricular foramen. Oh, I'm sorry. Interventricular foramen is up in here. This will go into the spinal cord in the central canal. So you can see lateral ventricles to interventricular foramen to the third ventricle to the cerebral aqueduct, the fourth ventricle. Typically, we don't test you on these connections, this interventricular foramen and the cerebral aqueduct. We just need you to know the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle, where they are. Here's a picture of the lateral ventricles. The third, you can see, is deep in there, and then the fourth. So in all reality, when you look at a real brain, these are not as big as these spaces. This is a drawing just to give you a perception of a cavity or an opening in there, but in reality, it's pretty tiny. Here they are from a MRI standpoint. You can see a little bit bigger there. So let's talk about cerebral spinal fluid. And we talked back in chapter 10 about neuroglia. And in the neuroglia, there was a specific cell that helped produce cerebral spinal fluid, and that was your epididymal cells. So there are capillaries that are going to work with that, and they're called the choroid plexus. They're in the pia mater layer, and you have your epididymal cells there as well. And they together will make cerebral spinal fluid. It is a selective amount of substances from your blood that forms cerebral spinal fluid. The job of cerebral spinal fluid is protection and nutrition. Protection, it gives it somewhat of a cushion for the brain, and nutrition to give nutrients to the brain tissue. It will help maintain a stable ionic concentration in the cerebral or in the central nervous system, and CSF will actually circulate. It has almost a pulse to it, where it will move throughout the ventricles, down the central canal of the spinal cord, and in the subarachnoid space in those areas. If you've ever heard of the therapy, cranial sacral therapy, they work on, it's a hands-on therapy that works on the cranial bones and the sacral area, and one of the intentions is to release tension. It's a very soft, mild treatment, to release tension on the cranial bones and the sacrum to help with the cerebrospinal fluid flow, which helps with symptoms of different things throughout the body. But that's an example of kind of a therapy that will help with your body's cerebrospinal fluid flow. There is these tiny little granule areas in the up near the cerebrum called arachnoid granulations, and this is what's going to help absorb any old CSF. So it's helping maintain the integrity of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, you won't be tested on the volume of CSF, but it's interesting to know that the average volume is 140 milliliters at a time. If you get a spinal tap measurement, they will draw cerebrospinal fluid out of your lumbar spine, typically, because that's where you have a larger subarachnoid space, and that measurement will tell if you have an increased amount of fluid from trauma or if there's an infection, so like a meningitis. It is very invasive and can cause quite a bit of pain and lingering pain later too, so spinal taps are not taken lightly. Here is that choroid plexus. It's again a capillary-like structure. All right, moving on to the brain. Well, we were on the brain, but now we're looking specifically at the parts. For functioning, it's kind of common sense, but basically this is our neural centers for sensory function, sensation and perception, motor command for your skeletal muscles, higher mental function such as memory and reasoning, neural centers for coordinating muscle movement, and neural centers for regulating visceral activity, so organ activity, as well as personality. We're going to be looking at all of these parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the three parts that consist of that. The cerebrum is first. It's your biggest part. It's the wrinkly part. There are two hemispheres, a left and a right. There is kind of a line right down the middle where our sagittal plane is. That is called the longitudinal fissure. And then in the deep inside, it connects your left and right cerebrum hemisphere is this structure that is called the corpus callosum. So let's start with just the major portions. We have again the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. We're not going to spend much time on the brain development, so in this part of your book, I would just kind of refer to the slide because it's just a basic description. You do not need to go into the different layers of embryonic development. That is pretty detailed and can get pretty confusing quickly. So basically just kind of read through just the basics here. So cells in the tissue around the ventricles will differentiate into various regions of the brain. So as the cells in this area of the ventricle are going through mitosis, as well as developing embryonically, they're going to differentiate, meaning they're going to specialize into certain parts of the brain. When you're a little embryo, the neural tube is the first thing that forms, and from there everything kind of gets formed, and that would be parts of the brain. This chart is showing us our embryonic layers. You can look through it, and but we won't test you on these details. The cerebrum is your largest part, and there's two hemispheres. They're separated by that longitudinal fissure, and will help. Is also separated by this meninges called the falx cerebri. The corpus callosum we'll look at in a little bit is their connection of the hemispheres. And the wrinkles or bumps of our cerebrum have names. The ridges, or the part that sticks out, the bump, is called the gyri, and the groove is called the sulci. Fissures is a deeper groove in the surface. The longitudinal will separate the cerebral hemispheres, and there's also a transverse fissure, separates your cerebrum from your cerebellum. Let's see if I have better pictures. Okay, here's our longitudinal fissure. Here's the gyri, the bump, and the indent is called the sulci. Here's our transverse fissure in orange, separating the cerebrum from the cerebellum. And here's your corpus callosum. This is from a sagittal view. Here's from the coronal view. You can see how that connects both hemispheres. Here's gyri again, sulci, and again from this view. We have 5 lobes of our cerebral hemispheres. The frontal lobe, right under the frontal bone, the parietal lobe, near the parietal bone, and the occipital lobe, under the occipital bone, the temporal lobe, near the temporal bone. So the nice thing about learning the brain structure is if you already know your cranial bones, this is easier. Now, deep underneath the temporal lobe is a hidden lobe called the insula. That is a deep one. You don't see that from the surface. You have to retract the temporal lobe away to see it. Here's frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and the insula. You can see how it's deep underneath. So the structure of the cerebrum consists of gray and white matter. The cerebral cortex is a thin layer of gray matter, which makes up the outermost layer of the cerebrum, and it contains almost 75% of the neural cellular bodies in the nervous system, which is saying a lot. That's a lot of your nervous system right there in that thin layer. If we look here, see this layer, this gray layer out here? That's what we're referring to. That's cerebral cortex. The white matter of the cerebrum is under that cerebral cortex, so all this white underneath. It makes up most of your cerebrum, and it contains bundles of myelinated axons that will connect neural cell bodies to the cerebral cortex to other portions of the nervous system. The cerebral cortex, that gray matter on the outside, is responsible for higher mental functions. So this is where we get our interpretation of sensory signals, initiating voluntary movement, storing information as memory, retrieving stored information, reasoning, intelligence, and personality. All of this is on that outside layer here of our cerebral cortex. So of this cortex, this outer layer, there are some functional regions in there. And so we can divide it into sensory, association, and motor. And some will overlap each other. Each area contains a group of neurons working together to perform a particular function. So for instance, in the frontal lobe, you have this concentrated area for frontal eye field. Down here is the Broca's area, which is our motor speech area. Right here over your ear, or near your ear, is the auditory area. and speech, our sensory area, is right next to it. We also have back here visual, occipital lobe. We have a concentrated visual area. Here's our white matter, gray matter, or cerebral cortex, and nuclei, which are these deep areas deep inside. So for sensory is going to be kind of the back half of the brain here, or the cerebrum. The cutaneous sensory area is the parietal lobe, and it interprets sensations on the skin. Sensory speech area is also called Wernicke's area, which is right here in green, and that is on the temporal and parietal lobe, and it's usually only on the left hemisphere. It's for understanding and formulating language. And so this is why if you have a stroke in this area, you have a difficult time understanding or formulating words. This can be pretty problematic if something happens here. Your visual area is in the back of the occipital lobe, interprets vision. So if you've ever maybe fallen on ice or ice skating or something and smacked your head really hard on the back of it and saw stars, well, or blacked out, most likely is because you've overstimulated this visual area in the back of your occipital lobe. Or if you have swelling in there, it could affect your vision as well. The auditory area is over the temporal lobe right here, and it interprets hearing. Sensory area for taste is near the base of the central sulcus, and the central sulcus is this line right here between this yellow and pink gyrus, and it includes part of the insula. The sensory area for smell is arising from centers deep within the temporal lobe. You should have a good understanding of where these are. You may see a couple questions on these sensory areas. I like this picture. It's really kind of weird, but it gives you a good understanding of how much distribution of nerves that we have to certain areas for sensory and motor. But let me first talk about this bottom picture. Here's our cerebrum from looking at the top, and the pink gyrus is motor. The yellow gyrus is sensory. So from our frontal lobe, this first gyrus in front of that central sulcus, which is the line that divides the two, this bump in front of it we will call the precentral gyrus, or the motor area, and the one behind the central sulcus is called the post-central gyrus, and that is the sensory area. Now if you look at these two pictures up here, they look sort of similar. You can see that in the cerebral cortex, in the sensory area, you can see this part here is finding sensation for the genital area, the toes and the foot, the leg, the thigh, the pelvis, the trunk, the neck, the arm, forearm, hand. Look how much space the hand and the fingers and the hand thumb have, as well as the face. These are huge amounts of nerves, which makes sense. You can feel more pinpoint specific sensation on your hand, in your fingertips, than you do in your pelvis. Same with your face. If something lightly touches your cheek, you know exactly where it's at. Something lightly touches your back, you can kind of get an idea where it is if you concentrate, but you can see there's way more input coming into from these areas. And then we have teeth, gums, tongue, pharynx, and abdominal. So you won't be tested on like where is this stuff, but this is just kind of fascinating to me to show you kind of how much nerve supply is gained, sensory information to the brain there. Oh, here's our pre and post central gyrus. So the central sulcus is going to be right between these two. Association areas of the cortex are regions that are not primarily motor or sensory, and they connect to each other and to other structures in the brain. This is widespread throughout the cerebral cortex. It's for analyzing and interpreting sensory experiences. It will provide memory, reasoning, verbalization, judgment, and emotions. In the frontal cortex, or frontal lobe, we have an association area that is for concentration, planning, problem solving, emotional behavior, judging consequences of behavior. So studying and taking your test, you're using your frontal lobe association area. The parietal lobe association areas is for speech, choosing words to express thoughts and feelings. The temporal lobe is for interpreting complex sensory experiences like understanding speech and reading, and it stores memories of visual scenes, music, and complex patterns. The occipital lobe association area is analyzing and combining visual images with other sensory experiences. And then the insula is translating sensory information into proper emotional responses. Moving on to motor areas of the cortex, we have the primary motor areas of the frontal lobe. They control voluntary muscles. They are also for most of those nerve fibers will cross over in the brainstem. Broca's area is a motor area anterior to the primary motor cortex. It is usually in the left hemisphere, and it controls muscles needed for speech. Again, Broca's area, if you damage that maybe by a stroke, let me highlight right here, Broca's area, you will have a difficult time speaking. Frontal eye field is above that Broca's area, and it controls voluntary movement of the eyes and the eyelids. Here's that exact same picture. We were looking at sensory over here, now motor. This map is pretty similar. Motor input out to the muscles is originating for the toe and foot here, leg, thigh, pelvis, arm, trunk, forearm, hand, and facial expression, and mastication. This is all large neural output there. Here's a chart. If you like charts, that will help give you a description of each of those lobes and the functions. Now, hemispheres have a dominance, and most people, the left side is the dominant side. The dominant hemisphere will control language, skills of speech, writing, and reading. Verbal, analytical, and computational skills are all on your dominant hemisphere. The non-dominant hemisphere will control nonverbal tasks, motor tasks, understanding and interpreting musical and visual patterns, and providing emotional and intuitive thought processes. Here's your left lobe. Memory is the consequence of learning, which is kind of a funny way to say it, but obviously with learning you're going to remember it, hopefully you learn it. There's two types of memory: short-term or working memory. This is where you have neurons in a closed circuit, meaning the circuit is stimulating over and over. When the impulse flow will cease. Memory does also, unless it enters into long-term memory by way of memory consolidation. Long-term memory is where you hold more memory than a short-term. It lasts a lifetime. It changes the structure or functions of neurons, and it enhances synaptic transmission. So learning anatomy in this in your college semester here, this is a perfect example of short-term memory, working memory. As you're learning something, if you do not repeat it over and over and over and over, it will not go into your long-term memory. It's scientifically proven. So that is why you have to read and do questions and write things out and ask people questions, get in study groups over and over and over this material. Memorizing it once will not stick. You have to get it repetitive into your brain. Otherwise, you won't have long-term memory of this. So that's a good example of it. Now, deep in the brain, in the cerebrum, we have this structure called the basal nuclei. Sometimes it's called the basal ganglia. It's masses of gray matter, and it consists of some parts called the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. You don't need to know the names of them, just know that the basal nuclei is deep in the cerebrum. And also I want you to know that it produces dopamine. Dopamine is an important chemical for helping control voluntary movement. We see problems with dopamine production in patients with Parkinson's disease. They have, for whatever reason, a problem producing dopamine, and thus they start to have loss of voluntary muscle control, or they'll have spasms or twitches, a whole number of muscle problems, and this is due to the basal nuclei either being damaged through repetitive injury. For instance, like Muhammad Ali, he was a boxer and he had his head, obviously banged in more than once, and so that likely damaged his basal nuclei, which will affect his dopamine production, which ultimately led to his Parkinson's. But in other people, for instance, the actor Michael J. Fox, he did not have trauma. It's unknown why he has Parkinson's. So it's a mystery. It's a scientific disease that is needs a lot of research and has been worked on for many years, but is still kind of one that is hard to determine what causes it and how to control it. Here's some pictures from a coronal section of the cerebrum showing us the basal nuclei. Moving on out of our cerebrum into the diencephalon. The diencephalon is between the cerebral hemispheres and above the brain stem. It surrounds the third ventricle. It's composed of gray matter, and it consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, optic tracts, which are your optic nerves that go to your eyes, the optic chiasma, which is still part of the optic nerve where it crisscrosses, a structure called the infundibulum. It's like a little tag that holds onto the pituitary gland. We have also these things called mammillary bodies and the pineal gland. This picture is kind of a crazy looking thing. This is what the diencephalon is if we would take it out of your head. This is from the posterior ventral view. Oh, no, front view, excuse me. And this is from the posterior ventral view, dorsal view. I like the side view personally better because that other one is weird looking. But this here is the diencephalon right here. The thalamus is going to be this middle section. The hypothalamus is in front of it. The infundibulum is this tiny little tag that hangs off of there, because here we have our pituitary gland being held on. Mammillary bodies are back behind the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland is the furthest in the back. The optic chiasm is part of this, where the optic nerves from the eyeball come in and crisscross. Here's the pituitary gland. It's kind of protected by the sphenoid bone, and this section of the sphenoid bone is called the sella turcica, but that sphenoid will kind of protect that pituitary gland. Here's pineal gland in the back end of the diencephalon. The thalamus is our major part of our diencephalon. It's the gateway for your sensory impulses that are going to the cerebral cortex. It receives all of your sensory information from your body except for one, smell. Smell does not come through the thalamus. It channels impulses to the appropriate parts of the cerebral cortex. I look at the thalamus as kind of like a switchboard. Do you remember like olden days when people had telephones that they would just pick up the receiver and talk to an operator and say, will you connect me to Mr. So-and-so? That operator had to take your line, unplug it, and stick it into another hole to Mr. So-and-so's line, and that would connect you. That's kind of what the thalamus does. It takes the information coming up from the sensory neurons and it puts it into the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex. It's kind of the switchboard of the brain. The hypothalamus is your homeostasis mechanism. That structure is helping regulate all of your visceral activity, such as heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, water, electrolyte balance, hunger, weight, movement, glandular secretions, sleep, wakefulness, and pituitary function. So like pretty much most all your activity is going to be maintained by your hypothalamus. It's going to make sure that everything is set at certain levels so you have a homeostatic, balanced body. This also links your nervous system and your endocrine system together. The limbic system is not one specific part. It is a collection of parts of the brain, including the diencephalon. And if with limbic, think emotion. It controls your emotional responses, feelings, behavior towards survival, and reacts to potentially life-threatening upsets, physical or physiological. So limbic, think emotional responses. There's the thalamus and the hypothalamus again. Moving on to the brainstem. So here's our diencephalon here. Brainstem is down here. It consists of the midbrain at the top, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. There's a brainstem from a front view, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. The midbrain is towards the top. It's a short section of the brainstem. It lies between the diencephalon and the pons. It contains bundles of fibers that join lower parts of the brainstem and the spinal cord with higher parts of the brain. There's a bunch of terms on here. You will not need to know any of these last bullet points. Just know it's that smallest section up at in the brainstem. I guess as far as function, you should probably know is it's going to have your visual, auditory reflexes, and postural reflexes in the midbrain. The pons is the bump that sticks out. It's a rounded bulge, and it helps sending signals from the medulla oblongata to the cerebrum, as well as from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. The key for function here is rhythm of breathing. That's the pons, is for breathing. And then the medulla oblongata is the larger enlarged bottom portion down here. It is our cardiac, vasomotor, and respiratory control center. This is vital, so if this is damaged, you will not live. some other non-vital parts that it helps with is controlling reflexes like sneezing, coughing, gagging, swallowing, and vomiting. And if you have, again, an injury in the medulla oblongata, it's usually fatal. So where this is in your body, it is very close to the foramen magnum. Actually, this medulla oblongata will extend down into C1, or the first vertebrae in the spine as well. Now here again is our brainstem, and this yellow line behind it is called the reticular formation. It's also called the reticular activation system. The key to remembering what this does is think wakefulness. Its main job is arousing the cerebral cortex into a state of wakefulness. So staying awake, your reticular formation is doing that. It's helping you stay awake. Decreased activity in that area will cause sleep. Now, if you have trauma, say to your neck and head, and you have swelling can push on this reticular formation or damage it, and will cause you to be put into a mode of sleeping that you can arouse from. So that's what a coma would be like. So often if a person has, significant trauma and they have swelling in their head, they're likely in a coma from it. And that's really for your body to protect the brain and heal, and, eventually the swelling will go down. Hopefully that reticular formation is intact and it will start working and wake you. Speaking of wakefulness and sleep, there are two types of sleep: non-rapid eye movement or non-REM sleep. This is a slow wave sleep. This is when a person is tired, probably like you are now listening to my voice. It decreases activity of your reticular formation. You are restful and dreamless. Your blood pressure drops, your respiratory rate drops some. There are 3 stages ranging from light to heavy, and it alternates then with also your rapid eye movement sleep, or REM, which is a paradoxal sleep, meaning it's some areas of the brain are active. So even though you're sleeping, your brain is still active. Your heart and respiration rates are going to be irregular, and dreaming is usually happening. So as you sleep throughout the night, you're going back and forth between these cycles. It's not one and then the other and when you wake up. It's kind of a cycle of back and forth. Cerebellum. This is that bundle in the back of the head by the occipital bone. And there are 2 hemispheres to it also, and it's separated by some meninges called the falx cerebelli. There is gray matter, cerebellar cortex, and white matter, which we call arbor vitae, which is kind of a funny name because that's what bushes are called, arbor vitae, but I think it's named that because it looks like branching like that. You don't need to worry about the vermis or the dentate nucleus. Just know the arbor vitae, the cerebellar cortex, and also what's its job. And the cerebellum is for integrating sensory information about body position, as well as coordinating skeletal muscle for posture. So think posture, balance. This is all cerebellum. Let me give you an example. I had a patient one time that I determined had a stroke in his cerebellum because of the way he walked. He looked like he was walking on a boat, and he was walking just down the hallway. He could not stand up straight. He could not definitely walk in a straight line, and he was sober. He had had a stroke, and it damaged his cerebellum to a point where he could no longer maintain proper body movement or posture. So damage to the cerebellum can really really affect your life. But the main job is, again, sensory information concerning your position of your body parts, as well as coordinating muscle for posture. There's your cerebellum. Here's another chart explaining the parts of the brain and their functions. All right, moving down into the spinal cord. It's a slender column of nervous tissue. It's continuous with the brain and the brainstem, and it extends downward through the vertebral canal. It begins at the foramen magnum and C1 area and terminates at the first and second lumbar, or L1-2 space. There's 31 segments, and each give rise to a pair of spinal nerves. Portions of the spinal cord are enlarged. The cervical area, lumbar, they both enlarge some. And then the conus medullaris is the end. Cauda equina is the very end where the lumbar bones are. And here is a cross section. We get to look at the parts of the cross section of the spinal cord. Here's images of what a spinal cord looks like. Kind of looks like a butterfly in there, of the gray matter and white matter difference. Don't worry too much about this picture, but this is showing you what a spinal nerve looks like. There is little nerves that come off of the dorsal part and the ventral part of the spinal cord. They then combine together, forming a root, and then as they exit the vertebrae area, it becomes a spinal nerve because it's combined. You have motor and sensory together in the spinal nerve. So let's look at some main functions of the spinal cord. The two main functions are it's a center for reflexes, as well as it's a conduit or a pathway for impulses to and from the brain. A reflex is this automatic, subconscious response to a stimuli within or outside the body. The reflex arc is a pathway consisting of a sensory receptor, 2 or more neurons, and an effector. So our simplest reflex contains only sensory and motor neurons. The most complex will have a sensory, an interneuron, and a motor neuron. So here is a picture of our basic reflex with an interneuron. Here is skin with the receptor in the skin, sending that signal down the sensory neuron to the back, the dorsal part of the spinal cord. And once it's internal, now the interneuron is going to make that decision and send a signal to the muscle by way of the motor neuron through the ventral portion. Motor will then go to an effector or a gland. Here is a muscle, effector, which is a muscle or a gland, and here it's a muscle. Here's the parts of the reflex. You can read that too. Monosynaptic, meaning one synapse. Here's an example of a stretch reflex. It consists of 2 neurons, sensory and motor, and 1 synapse in the spinal cord. So here's sensory information going up to the spinal cord, and it synapses and sends a motor signal down to the muscle. Our knee-jerk reflex that you probably have had tested before, or the patellar reflex, this is a monosynaptic reflex, and this is important for proper upright posture. All right, this is where I need to help you a little with differentiating or deciding what parts to learn. This can get quite detailed, and it's good to know kind of what these tracks are, but let's look at them kind of as an overview. In the spinal cord, you have ascending tracks and descending tracks. Ascending tracks are ones that travel up to the spinal, up to the brain, so they're going to be sensory. Descending are motor, so they travel away from the brain or down the spinal cord and out. A track, think of like a railroad track. That's kind of what this is. It's a path of information. There's a bunch of names here. We're going to go through some of them. So let's look at the major ascending sensory spinal tracts. One way you can kind of tell whether it's a sensory or motor is by its name. Now the first one is a little difficult, but the second two bullet points, you can see the word spine in them. That's its starting point. It's starting at the spine, and then it's going to either the thalamus or the cerebellum. So that should tell you it's going from the spine up, so it has to be sensory. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus are a little trickier. You're just going to have to memorize those, I suppose. But let me tell you a little bit about what they do. Fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus are going to be sensory impulses from skin, muscles, tendons, joints. This is for touch, pressure, and body movement. Spinothalamic is a sensory tract that is pain and temperature. Spinocerebellar tract is again a sensory information, and this is going to be for coordinating muscle movement, and primarily of the lower limb, trunk, or lower limb and trunk. Descending or motor tracts, we have corticospinal. So these are going to be a little easier. They all end in the word spinal, meaning it starts in the brain, goes to the spine. It starts in the brain, goes to the spine. So it's going down, has to be motor. So corticospinal is the first one. Corticospinal is important with voluntary muscle control. That's its main job. Reticulospinal tracts is the next one, and they are going to be important for muscle tone, as well as sweat gland activity. Rubrospinal tract, again, is going to help with coordinating muscle activity. So that would probably be enough to know for those. The pictures are just kind of showing you their path and where they end up, and showing you that at certain areas they're going to cross. You don't need to know it to that level, but it's just giving you a visual. All right, now we're going to go into the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system we will not get too detailed on. So as far as like how to study this, I'm going to point out the things that you need to know. So listening to this is going to be helpful for you. First, let's just talk about the two major parts of the peripheral nervous system. That is our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves. Cranial is going to be in the head, so rising from the brain. Spinal is rising from the spinal cord. Pretty self-explanatory there. The PNS, or peripheral nervous system, is also divided into you can divide that further into somatic nervous system and the autonomic. We talked about this back in chapter 10. Somatic means conscious activity, and autonomic, think automatic, so organs. Here's a little breakdown of the nervous system. So let's look at nerves first, the peripheral nerves. This kind of looks like our muscle picture, doesn't it? It's similar in some ways, but this is nerves. So nerves are bundles of axons, and there's connective tissue around them. And here we can see our prefixes epi, peri, and endo. Remember, epi is going to be very outside, endo is the very inside. So neurium, think nerve. So here's a peripheral nerve. It has the epineurium on the outside. And here's a fascicle, just like our muscle, a bundle. And that is also going to be surrounded by perineurium. And then if we pull out an axon from there, that's going to have endoneurium around it. And here is our individual Schwann cells. Sensory nerves will conduct impulses to the brain, motor away from the brain to muscles and glands. Mixed nerves are usually your spinal nerves, and that means that has sensory and motor with it. All of them except for the first pair are a mixed nerve. So let's look at some classifications. The cranial and spinal nerves are subdivided into general and specialized. General somatic efferent fibers, if we look at the breakdown of these words, it tells you what it is. General meaning the whole body in a sense, general structures. So somatic, think voluntary control, so it's going to be a skeletal muscle. Efferent means exiting the central nervous system, so this is motor. This is a motor impulse from the CNS to the skeletal muscles. General, visceral, efferent. Visceral is organ, so smooth muscle, glands. Efferent, again, is away from the CNS, so motor control. General somatic afferent. Somatic is going to be skeletal, skin. And afferent is to the CNS, so this is sensory. And then general visceral afferent. Visceral is organ, afferent is sensory, so it's a general sensory impulse to the CNS from blood vessels and internal organs. Specialized, think head. This is specialized structures only found in cranial nerves. So specialized somatic efferent. Somatic is muscle, efferent is motor. So with motor impulses from the brain to muscles used for chewing, swallowing, speaking, and forming facial expressions. Specialized visceral afferent. Visceral is organ, afferent is sensory. So sensory impulses to the brain from the olfactory and taste receptors. Special somatic afferent fibers. Again, somatic is going to be like voluntary control. Afferent is sensory, so sensory impulses to the brain from receptors of sight, hearing, and equilibrium. So cranial nerves. I think every anatomy student hates cranial nerves. I know I did when I was first learning them. It's because there's so many of them. There's 12 pairs on the underside of the brain. Most are mixed nerves. Some are sensory, associated with special senses, and some are primary motor. Most are attached to the brain stem, and they're numbered in order going from the nasal cavity. The first pair has fibers starting in the nasal area. Nasal cavity, second originates in the eyes. And then we go backward from there to the back of the head. So they're numbered with Roman numerals. If you have never used Roman numerals before, guess what? You get to learn them now because that is, you will always see Roman numerals when we're talking about cranial nerves. I have never seen them not referenced that way. So here is a picture of our cranial nerves, and they're obviously cut so that you can just see the original sections of them. Let's start with number 1, olfactory. Olfactory is nose, smelling, sense of smell. You should know the names, their number, and their function. You know, their location is probably sort of important. I mean, with olfactory and optic, they're going to be the easiest ones to figure out. I want you more importantly knowing their function. Optic nerve is number 2, and this is for vision. There's going to be a lot of cranial nerves for eyes, so maybe make a chart of general functions like vision. Smelling only has one, olfactory. Optic is number 2, and that is for vision. This is coming right off of the back of the eyeball and passing through into the back where that optic chiasm is by the diencephalon. Here is our olfactory nerve. You can see it's right underneath the frontal lobe. There's the olfactory nerve. There's your optic nerve coming from that man's eyeball to the back. And there is the chiasm. Basically, that nerve comes back and then it crisscrosses right here. We'll look at chapter 12 is the next chapter, and we're going to go over sensor, like vision, hearing, all of that. Number 3 is oculomotor. It tells you in its name what it is. It has to do with the eyes and motor control. So voluntary muscles for eyelids and eyes are coming from number 3. Trochlear is number 4. This is a smaller pair. It's a motor nerve, and it's for impulses of muscles of the eye. There is oculomotor. There's trochlear. Number 5 is cranial, or 5 is trigeminal, and it's a big one. It is 3 parts to it. It's a mixed nerve. It's the largest pair of cranial nerves. Number 1, or the top part of it, is the ophthalmic division, going to the surface of the eyes. This is sensory, and tear glands, scalp, forehead, upper lids. Number 2 is the maxillary portion, and it's sensory for the upper teeth, upper gums, upper lip, palate, and skin of face. And number 3 is down in the lower jaw, the mandible. It's sensory from the scalp, the skin of the jaw, lower teeth, lower gum, and lower lip. The motor is for muscles of mastication or chewing. So, airbags in your car. If you have an accident and your airbag goes off, this can really do some damage to trigeminal nerve. I have had a few patients with trigeminal neuralgia, which is basically inflamed trigeminal nerve. And it was either due to trauma, like an airbag, and it's extremely painful for people. They'll tell you that their face feels like it's on fire. And honestly, chiropractic helps a lot. It diminishes the symptoms. It doesn't go away, but it really helps a lot. Steroids too can help decrease the swelling with an injury. But you have a lot of sensory information traveling through this trigeminal nerve. There, you see, look at it's just all over the surface of the face. So there it is. And its divisions. So know the name, know its divisions, and it's mostly sensory. Number 4 is abducens. It's a motor nerve, and it controls impulses to pairs of muscles of eyes. So again, more eye stuff. Number 7, is facial. It's a mixed nerve, so we have some sensory from taste receptors, as well as motor for facial expression, tear glands, and salivary glands. There's abducens and facial. Number 8 is vestibulocochlear nerve. This is your hearing and your balance. There's 2 branches, the vestibular branch and the cochlear branch, hence the name vestibulocochlear. Vestibular is for equilibrium. Cochlear is for hearing. We will look at this, these parts of the head, the ear, and its functions in detail in the next chapter, but you should know its cranial nerve and its branches. And then we have number 9, glossopharyngeal. It's a mixed nerve, sensory from the pharynx, the tonsils, and part of the tongue. The name glosso means tongue, pharyngeal, think pharynx. Motor to the salivary glands and muscles of the pharynx for swallowing. Here is vestibulocochlear going into the ear, and glossopharyngeal in the pharynx and the tongue. Number 10, vagus nerve. This is, well, they're all important, but this is a mother of cranial nerves. This is so huge, and it has major function to your organs. It's going to practically everything in your abdomen and your thorax. It is going to be motor control for muscles of speech and swallowing, automatic or autonomic motor control of your heart, and the viscera of your thorax and abdomen. Sensory from the pharynx, larynx, esophagus, and viscera of your thoracic and abdomen cavities. So vagus is, first of all, not spelled like the city, but it's a really significant cranial nerve. Again, you can see it's originating up in the head and it's traveling down through the spine. And this can be affected by position of vertebrae and can affect your visceral function. Some patients that I've seen that likely have vagus nerve irritation may get nauseous easily or have increased heart rate. So, sometimes it's not necessarily the organ that's having an issue, it's the nervous supply to the organ. And that's what we do. We look at your nervous system by way of your spine. Here is the vagus nerve traveling down. Number 11 is accessory. It's a primary motor. It used to be called the spinal accessory. It has a cranial and a spinal branch. In the cranial branch, it joins the vagus nerve and is for motor to muscles of the soft palate, the pharynx, and the larynx. In the spinal branch, it goes to muscles of the neck and the back. Really, this is the only cranial nerve that's having a motor function to muscles in your neck and back. Everything else is mostly head. Number 12, the last one, hypoglossal. We see the word glossal again, and that means tongue. This is motor. So motor to muscles of the tongue for speaking, chewing, and swallowing. And there's a little bit of sensory in there too. So that's your cranial nerves. Here's accessory and hypoglossal. Here's a little chart. There's a lot of mnemonics out there that will help you memorize them. I just recently saw, I think it was on Facebook or Pinterest or something, and you can Google it. If you are a huge Harry Potter fan, I guess there's a mnemonic for your cranial nerves with Harry Potter characters. I am not a Harry Potter fan, so this would not be helpful to me, but maybe it would be to you. Sometimes in anatomy, you just have to memorize an order, and mnemonics are perfect for that, for memorizing the order of these. Spinal nerves. So we did cranial, now we're doing spinal. And thank the Lord that spinal nerves don't have names, because that would be a lot of them. There's 31 pairs of your spinal nerves. They do have, they sort of have names. They're named by the area of the spine that they're exiting. So in the neck, that's your cervical spine. They're called cervical nerves. In the middle of your thoracic spine, they're thoracic nerves. Down in the lower back, there's the lumbar vertebrae, so they're lumbar nerves. And down in your pelvis, you have the sacral bone, so the sacral nerves come from there. And at the very end, your coccyx or your tailbone is the coccygeal nerve. Maybe just kind of get a good understanding of how many are each. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, 1 coccygeal. If you know your spinal sections, this shouldn't be too hard. Now the cauda equina is the end of the spinal cord in the lumbar area. It goes from like around L1 down to the sacrum. And these are, the reason it's called cauda equina, it means horsetail, I believe. And this is, it looks like a horse's tail, but there's nerves coming from the spinal cord there, and they are not as bundled, I guess, as above, like in the cord. Here's some spinal nerves as they exit the spine. This is where I'm going to kind of briefly touch on the parts of the spinal nerve. There's a lot of detail to spinal nerves, and you do not need to know them to that level. I want you to know a couple basic parts of the spinal nerve. The dorsal part, or the posterior part, is called the dorsal root. If we look at, here's our cross section, see that little nerve coming off of here? That's your dorsal root. And dorsal root is sensory. You have to know that dorsal is sensory, ventral is motor. Here's the ventral root, and that's going to be motor control. So for dorsal root, think no sensory. Now you don't need to know the dorsal root ganglion. Basically it has cell bodies of sensory neurons in this bundle before it exits the spine. Just know dorsal sensory. So speaking of sensory, we have a pattern in our body due to the innervation or the nerve supply to certain areas of the skin and muscles. And this is a perfect map to show us what's wrong with the body. So if you have numbness in your pinky and your ring finger, you likely have irritation of the C8 spinal nerve. And that can be coming from its origination down up in the C7 vertebrae. But this is a map telling us, so say you get pain shooting down the front of your calf, you probably have a problem with L5 nerve. Again, we looked at dorsal, that's sensory. Ventral is motor. So ventral's coming off, and that's motor control. Once the two combine outside of the spine, they're now a spinal nerve. It's called a mixed nerve because it has motor and sensory in it. Now there's branches off of this, and some will go to the meninges, so it'll just kind of wrap right back around. Some will go back to the dorsal part of the body, some forward to the ventral part of the body, and some to only in the organs, so visceral branch. You don't need to know the rami. You can skip over that. Plexuses. I want you to know the 3 nerve plexuses, the names, and the general area it is. So let's look at them. A plexus is a network of ventral rami, meaning ventral nerves of the spinal nerves. We don't have plexuses in the rib cage area, so T2 to T12. So there's 3. We have kind of 2 up in the neck and 1 in the low back. The cervical plexus is going to be formed of C1 to C4 spinal nerves. And here we can look at it, here is the cervical plexus. You can see as they come out through the vertebrae, then they branch off a lot. Our phrenic nerve comes off of here. Phrenic nerve is what controls your diaphragm for breathing. Here it is, phrenic nerve. Brachial is lower, and that's going into the arm. Whiplash will definitely cause problems in these areas, which can give you pain down your arm, numbness, tingling, stuff like that. Here's brachial, coming from the lower cervical into the arm. You do not need to know the branches of the brachial plexus. Maybe read them if you're curious. Maybe you'll need to know them when you're a nurse, but for this class, you do not need to know them. Look at those big nerves. Man, they're huge. And there's a lot of them in there. So if you get whiplash, you can tear the muscles and you can even tear these brachial plexuses. So trauma in this area can be pretty significant to the arm. Lumbosacral complex, coming from the lumbar and the sacrum. Look at all these connections. These all kind of lace together, and they will form a bunch of nerves. There's the obturator nerve, the femoral nerve, and the sciatic nerve. Now, you won't be tested on these, but I'm talking about the sciatic because I would say most of you know what I've heard of sciatica. Sciatica is an inflamed sciatic nerve, and the sciatic nerve is humongous. It is like the size of a dime. And to give you a perspective, most nerves are about the size of a hair follicle. So this is huge. It's got a ton of nerves in it. And so this is your longest nerve in your body, and it supplies your thigh, your leg, your feet. When it's irritated, it is pretty painful. Shooting pain, typically, down the back of the thigh, down the front of the calf, into the foot. Sitting repetitively, like I currently am reading this to you, will shorten some of the muscles in your buttocks, which can pinch the sciatic nerve, because as it exits out of the pelvis, it goes through some of the muscles. And so if you sit a lot, you can get sciatica. Stretching in there, getting massage in there, that will help. But also misaligned vertebrae in the spine. If these are twisted, they're going to put pressure on their nerve roots, which will cause pain as it travels down the leg. So adjustments are really successful. I'm telling you, low back pain is the #1 reason people come see me. And it's pretty successful. I mean, there's a handful of people over the last 18 years I've been in practice that I haven't been able to help, but most people get relief with low back pain and chiropractic, and most of them are going to come in with sciatica. Not all, but it's a big common one, that's for sure. Here's your lumbar plexus, coccygeal, oops, oh, and there's sciatic over on this picture. Now, the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's automatic, so there's no conscious effort here. This is organ controls, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle. This is for homeostasis. It also responds to stress, and it prepares the body for exercise or any intense physical activity. The ANS, or autonomic nervous system, is divided into 2 parts, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is what prepares your body for fight or flight situations. It's going to speed up the body. It's going to dilate your eyes so that more light comes in. It's going to increase your heart rate so you can start running. It's going to increase your breathing. So it's going to open up the bronchial tubes. So anything in a fight and flight situation is sympathetic. Parasympathetic is the opposite. It's rest and digest. It's slowing the body down for non-stressful conditions. Most of our organs will receive nerve input from both divisions. You do not need to know this slide. This is just talking about 2 motor pathways in the autonomic nervous system. That's just kind of move on from this one. The sympathetic division is going to be, think rib cage in your thoracic area. This is where you have a sympathetic chain of ganglia, or it's kind of like a power strip on the side of the spinal cord. This is the sympathetic trunk. That's pretty much all you need to know about it. That chain is going to be near the organs it controls. That's all you need to know. You do not need to know this either. I apologize that it's in here, but You can read through it, but I will not test you on preganglionic and postganglionic fibers. I like this picture though. This gives us a good visual of their sympathetic nervous system. That is going to be all middle of the back, rib cage, thoracic area. So here we have this, like I said, a power strip almost. This ganglia, it sends a signal to there, and then it's going to shift it to its organ. So you can see all of the organs have some sympathetic control, and it's coming from the middle of the spine. Parasympathetic is going to be on the opposite ends. It's going to be the cranial and the sacral areas. Again, you don't need to know pre and post ganglionic information, but this gives us a good picture. Here is the cranial portion and the sacral portion, and then that's going to distribute its nerves out into the organs. Last but not least, our nervous system will start, brain cells especially, will start to die before we're even born. And that's natural. This is due to apoptosis, which is normal cell death. It's normal cellular death, programmed. But over your lifetime, your brain starts to shrink by 10%. More gray matter than white matter is lost with aging, and many cells die in the temporal lobe, but few in the brainstem. By age 90, the frontal cortex has lost half of its neurons, and the number of dendritic branches in the cerebral cortex decreases. You have decreased levels of neurotransmitters as well, which are chemicals that help control your nervous system. Your memory starts to fade, reflexes and response slows down, so then you have a more increased risk of fainting or falling. Changes in sleep patterns also change, and so you get fewer sleeping hours. This is like not the fun part of the chapter, because we always talk about what goes wrong as you age. All right, that is chapter 11. That was your biggest nervous system chapter, and we covered pretty much most of it. I'm glad that you listened through the PNS portion, because if you don't, then you're going to read a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily need to know for this course. So email me if you have any questions. Have a good day.